Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This episode is using astral projection to contact the dead. Before we get into it, just want to mention Patreon. We have a lot of great supporters on Patreon, and if you're interested, you get advanced videos on Sunday. There's no commercials, and there's an email where we can talk back and forth, and you can ask questions, I can answer them, and of course, we can also share experiences. If you're interested, there'll be a link in the description. Next up, private astral projection lessons. If you'd like a private lesson with me, I'm more than glad to work with you. I don't care whether you're an advanced student or just a beginner. If you're interested, there is an email in the description, and I'll send you the necessary information. Let's get started. Now, one of the questions that comes up on a semi-regular basis, and it came up again recently, involves using astral projection as a way to contact those who've passed on. Now, if the question is it possible to contact someone who's passed on using astral projection? The short answer is yes. The more complete answer is a bit more complex. And that's what I'd like to discuss. And I'd also like to share with you why I, despite the fact that there's been numerous folks who've contacted me and offered me all kinds of money or whatever to do that for them, and I have reluctantly turned them down as politely as I could for some of these reasons, which I'm going to share with you now. First, spirit mediums. These are people who can, while in a conscious state, or sometimes in a semi-hypnotic state, can communicate with those who've passed on. I believe there are and have been people who can legitimately do this. Unfortunately, the field itself, I believe, is replete with charlatans. People who are smart, observant, do their research, are good at something called cold reading, which is looking at someone and then making a lot of judgments that are probably pretty close based on their looks and how they act and what have you. And unfortunately, the field itself I consider to be a very mucky, murky one. One which I am extraordinarily reluctant to dive into because of all of the sludge that I suspect strongly is present. Now, let me mention some folks. Now, I don't know, maybe you like some of these folks, maybe you don't. I am not saying that 100% that I have proof, on the incontrovertible proof, that these people are fakes. However, I have a certain signal that goes off in my head when I hear people. And some of these guys, when I hear them talk, and gals, when I hear them talk, that signal goes off, and it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Some examples. There used to be, and probably still are, preachers on TV. And they would get what's called a word of knowledge. And they'd say, basically it meant like God was kind of talking to them. And they'd say, I'm getting a message that this person's having this problem and whatever. And then one person would stand up or whatever and say, that's me. And then it'd be, that's miraculous. And they give them the message from God or whatever, Jesus, and you name it. And then you'd find out that what would happen is before the service or the tent pole sermon or demonstration would occur, that there'd be people that worked for this guy who would talk with people coming in, just have some little conversations about what's going on in their life and how they're doing. And then these people would share, like, oh, I'm having this problem, or this person just passed, or this happened. And then they'd make little notes. And then the minister or whatever up front there, the preacher, would have like a little hearing aid. I guess they all have problems hearing. And there'd be communication. And this has been proven back and forth. So it was all one big scam to collect money from poor, I don't like using the word gullible, but desperate people. And desperate people are willing to believe just about anything. And I just dislike the idea of fleecing poor people who are in pain and desperate. I just find that vile and disgusting. There's other folks a little bit more well-known. There is the Long Island medium, otherwise known as Teresa Caputo. I've seen her show on numerous occasions, and all I can say is she's got this weird dyed blonde bouffant. I don't know what that's all about. She claims to have the ability. She leaves a weird taste, and I get that signal. I'm not comfortable with her. Another person is John Edward. Now, he used to have, and this is probably when some of the people listening to me here were probably too young to watch a show like this, but between the year 2000 and 2004, he had a show called Crossing Over with John Edward. And South Park did a funny episode way back then. In the episode, this psychic spirit medium, whatever, John Edward, was one of the characters. And he was celebrated eventually as winning the Douche of the Galaxy award. The episode was though, as many times with South Park, was very interesting. They talked about cold reading, for instance, which, as I indicated earlier, is something that I think John Edward uses quite a bit. Now, in his show, he would do something like this. Now, I don't know if he had people talking to some of these folks as they were coming in, just like the preachers used to do. I would not be surprised to hear that. But I did witness his show on several occasions, and to me, it looked like he was using cold reading. He'd say something like, I'm getting a message from John or Johnny or Jack, and, he has this to say, some general thing. And then some 35-year-old woman or whatever would stand up, and she'd be crying, and she'd have a wedding ring on, and then she said, oh, it's my Jack, it's my Jack. So right away, John Edwards looking at her, and he's thinking, she's looks like she's in her early to mid 30s. If her Jack, she's crying about her Jack, and she's here at this show where you're supposed to talk, where he's supposed to be talking and giving messages from all kinds of spirits. He's thinking either it's a baby or it's her husband. Now, because of her age, a lot of people, like for instance, if you talked to my mother when I was a young child, she would have referred to me as Ricky, for instance. And many people do something very similar to that. But he makes a guess, and he says, I'm getting that he was your husband and he died in an untimely way. Well, no kidding. I mean, yeah, I guess there's a theoretical chance that this attractive, 30-something woman could have married a guy who was 80. But for the most part, if she's crying and it's her husband and he passed, yeah, it was probably an untimely death. Okay? And then he'd say something like, I'm getting a message from him, and he's saying, don't worry about the money. It's going to be okay. Well, that's another easy ball to throw out there. Because 95% of the time, when someone passes, there is some sort of concern, argument, contention about money. So these are the types of things that I would see him do on his show. And I found it distasteful. I don't know for sure whether he is a fraud, but he wears a fraud's clothing. So I don't know. Make of that what you will. So there's a fairly disreputable group of these people. And as I said, there's probably some legit folks in there somewhere that may be legitimately helping people and who I've never heard of and I never will hear of because they didn't make it to TV or whatever else. But because of the company, I mean, you're judged by the company you keep. And I don't want to be among company like that. So that's one reason why I like to stay out of that end of things as far as astral projection is concerned. The next thing is asking folks, or folks ask you to contact people who you never knew personally. Now, imagine if an alien came down to Earth and introduced himself to you and started asking you questions, and maybe he asked you, maybe he knew a little bit about things, and he said, "Oh, what's the name of the person who rules your country?" And you say, "Oh, it's President Biden right now." Who's your favorite actor? Since you talked about, we showed him movies or whatever, and you tell him, "Oh, it's this guy or this other person, whatever." Or who's your favorite, sports star? Because maybe you showed him, tried to explain to him what football was all about, or baseball was all about, or soccer, or what have you. And you tell him, "Oh, it's this person." And then they say, "Oh, okay. Well, could you contact them real quick and then talk to them and ask them some questions for me?" Now, we know as people who are experienced on the physical that just because you know the name of someone, like a president or an actor or a famous sports star, and you're both on the physical plane, that doesn't mean you can just pick up the phone and call them or go meet them. Why? Because these are people who thousands, and in some cases millions of folks would love to get at. So there's numerous layers between you and them. Now, there's always the chance that you'll be on Rodeo Drive somewhere and you'll be shopping, and all of a sudden you'll run into some favorite star of yours, and if they're nice, they'll do a quick selfie with you. But let's face it, that's not something that's going to happen on a kind of regular basis. So it always kind of amazes me because, once again, as above, so below. The astral plane is not that different from the physical plane in certain basic ways. Just because I know the name Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla or Abraham Lincoln or what have you, it doesn't mean, assuming they haven't already reincarnated, of course, doesn't mean that I can just get in contact with them without having any knowledge of them personally, without them knowing me personally, without me having any sense for their vibrations. It would be literally the same level of difficulty that we would have here in the physical. Now, next up is timing. I have noticed that if you know someone, you know them well, and you can contact them on the astral within a few weeks to maybe a month or so of their passing, assuming they didn't die from a long, draining, debilitating illness, which might send them immediately to a healing plane, which is generally outside of your ability to reach them. Generally, they are close to the physical plane. They're going through a certain grieving process, and it is possible to contact them. I contacted my grandmother soon after she passed. using astral projection when I was a teenager. I also was able to contact my father-in-law shortly after he passed and was able to pass on some messages to my wife and her family. It gets infinitely more complicated when a long period of time has passed because souls don't stand still typically. They are always moving forward. If they're very advanced, they could have moved on to the mental plane, which is not easy to contact to begin with. It's very difficult. Or more likely, if it's been a long period of time, they have reincarnated and they're no longer on the astral plane. I did some experimentation when I was about 12 years old because this was a topic that was of interest to me. I was aware, obviously, of spirits who had passed on, especially the ones who were earthbound, because you couldn't avoid them at times until I figured out how to fly and get away. But I remember I read this book because this was of concern to me even when I was younger, 12 years old. You can communicate with the unseen dead. And it was all about using things like automatic writing, which I think is spoken now more of spirit writing. I don't recommend it because if you're a vulnerable individual, you can open yourself up to unpleasant situations. But luckily, I was of fairly strong mind, and I also knew enough at that point because of my researches to provide some basic protections. But I did some automatic writing, and I wanted to find out what the name of my future wife would be. And I remember back then I was very much interested in, boy, I'm going to marry this exotic beauty. I'm going to, someone like with a name like Angelique or something like that. And when I looked down, what I saw there was a very plain American name, Lynn. And I recall being very disappointed. Although, of course, many years later, I end up meeting that person. And we've now been married for over 30 years. But so it's been something that's been on my mind. It's been of interest to me. But these are some of the reasons why I find that it is highly unlikely that some of these folks who claim to be spirit mediums are able to so easily contact people who they've never met and have no knowledge of and what have you. I'm allowing, as I said before, that I think there are people who have the ability to do this. It's not me. I'm not a spirit medium and have no wish to be, because real spirit mediums can have some psychological and other problems because of how they have to lower certain safeguards to do this. So if I see someone who tends to be very healthy and fairly well adjusted and they seem to have everything going on, well, that puts a little more doubt in me because I know what would be required to really access that kind of information. And it's what I consider an unacceptable sacrifice. Anyway, that's something that I wanted to address because it does come up, and I wanted to speak on this topic. If you found it interesting, please hit the like button, share it with those of like mind, subscribe if you haven't already. And most of you have, it's amazing. I see the average channel has like maybe 10, 15, at most 20%, whereas I've got like 80% of the people who are subscribed, who watch these videos. That's amazing. I mean, it's free, right? Make sure the bell's on so you get notified on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning when I have the new videos. And just to let you know, this week when these videos are airing, they will be the last videos until January 4th, which is a Wednesday. I will be going up to visit my family and my lovely, talented daughter. and spend some great time with her. So I won't be publishing videos during that time, and it's after it's the holidays. You don't. Chances are you got other things to do than listen to me yak on and on about astral projection. So once again, I just want to thank everyone. This is Rick, and as always, I will see you on the astral plane.